anything more about that, John can introduce that himself. I'll just say a couple of things to introduce John himself. He's a senior lecturer in European International Studies at King's College London. His most recent research has focused on the understudied transnationalism of Black power and the political theories created by groups such as the Black Panther Party. John also sits on the Council of the Institute of Race Relations and is part of the
meeting is being recorded.
Race and Class. This is also our first hybrid event, or well, it's the first one I've been involved with. I think John did one last semester, which wasn't a great success.
Forget about that.
So let's see how that works. But it's really good. As you can see, quite a lot of people joining us online. We are recording this, so I think we do say on our poster that if you come along or join us online, you are consenting to being recorded, and the recording will then be placed on the centre's YouTube account. So I'm taking tacit consent from everybody. Great. So over to you, John.
Are we good? Okay. Let me just get some slides up.
Yeah, while you're doing that, I'll just say hello to people joining us online, because I referred to them, but I didn't actually greet or welcome them. So thank you very much for joining us. You'll be able to participate in the Q&A later.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for the warning, Tariq, because I guess if it's being recorded, we have to watch what we say. Don't want anyone to get locked up. So, is that okay? Or you want to share it with the other people? Okay, cool. As it does that. What I'm going to do today is essentially, I was a bit worried actually when I did this, because this is really an international political economy talk, and I was like, sociology people be interested, but I think I gave this talk to the international political economy crew, and I said you'll be interested in the first bit, not so much in the last bit, but I think you guys will be interested in both bits. All right, so essentially this work comes out of some transition in my own research, which is a centers on the kind of end, if you put it in inverted brackets, of neoliberalism, or the change of in the global economy, how that impacts conceptions of racialization, and specifically racial inequality on a global level. And specifically what I get at is I think the end of neoliberalism debate is inherently Eurocentric. Right? So I don't know what's happening here, because who knows what's happening here, but the change of state structures here is not necessarily the change of the imperial structures of the global economy. But what I want to read into that is how then does anti-racism respond, in a sense, to these changing conditions of global capital, and how has, I want to say dominant, but one of the most popular versions of anti-racist thinking and theorizing, which is abolitionism, beautiful idea. How is that impacted by elements of this, and how may history tell us how we should be recoding our anti-racist analysis in such a changing global environment? So I guess it sounds pretty good. I don't know if it's going to be pretty good, all right? So let's crack on. So, all right. So up until recently, you'll see when I come to this recently. And by the way, I don't have a lot of text. I just read pictures. All right. Some of them are funny. Some of them are not. Up until recently, in the last year or two, there's been a debate, specifically on the left, in terms of economic ideology, about what is happening to the era of neoliberalism, right? This era that we've all researched, teach, and we talk about it, we use it as a short-term word for essentially the changes in global capital that happened in the late 70s, heading into the 80s, but really solidified into the mid-90s with the creation of the World Trade Organization, the ascension of Chinese labor into the global economy. And, you know, I don't know how old people are, but in the early 2000s, there was just a moment where everything got a little bit cheaper, right? Not only because of technological innovation, but largely because nearly 1 billion people have been brought into the labor market, right? Highly exploited, creating many of the items. Some of you will be watching this on at home. Most of us are glued to on our phones, right? So that era, though, is being argued to have come to an end, largely because global supply chains are changing. As I'll talk about in a second, environmental factors mean that the global economy can no longer function in the way it used to. And so there's been a bit of a debate around the return of essentially the state, right? So neoliberalism was supposed to hollow out the state. Again, I think this is empty rhetoric. For those of us who do anti-racist research, the state never really went away. But you know, the state retracted, welfare was attacked. We had an era of austerity. And in the last year or two, the debate has been, well, that era is over. Right, so Paulo Gobardo's work in The Great Recoil kind of makes an argument for the return of the state. Sorry, people at home, I do walk about. James Medway, who was an advisor to Jeremy Corbyn, right, who's very good on Twitter, has argued for, well, neoliberalism is dying, right? And in a sense, something else is emerging. And his argument is it could be even worse than neoliberalism. Not sure what's worse, but let's see what could be worse. And there's been this kind of debate, and I end up in these circles where I'm saying, oh, okay, that's really interesting. Who's it over for, right? And you could actually put some kind of real driving factors behind this. Like I said, one of the things that's happened to global supply chains isn't necessarily just the breakdown of an order that existed for 20 to 30 years, but also has been kind of premised around shocks to that supply chain, right? So you've had US-Chinese battle for hegemonic power, but you've also got ecological factors, which now mean that the supply chains can no longer work in the way they used to, or they actually drive up prices and don't lead to very good outcomes for us as consumers. So one could make the argument about gas, but this is Bloomberg charges for access, but you can read it. It's a quite interesting thing about how drought is pushing up grain prices in South America, in South North America, right? So neoliberalism as we know it, that global economy that kind of slid around, provide us cheap goods, cheap food, especially us in the global north, we could make the argument that it's coming to an end, right? And then you've seen recently, I know she wasn't around long, but you've seen a return of the state ways of spending. So for 10 years, we were told there was no magic money tree. You remember that one? There was no money to do nothing. And then suddenly when capital was going to basically end, because most of us froze to death in the winter or early next year, again, capital turned up, right? Suddenly we found money. The magic money tree was found. And then although she had to roll back on this, I don't think the markets would have reacted back badly just to her £100 billion plan for when
Sorry to interrupt, but the sound is off. You're muted, John.
Oh,
that was the tagline of 2020, wasn't it? I've unmuted myself.
Uh,
Oh dear.
is it working now?
We can hear you now, thank you.
Okay, can I start again? All right, so
Hopefully the pictures conveyed something.
so I'm guessing John, was your event this bad or
No,
slightly better? We can compare later. No? All right, so in a sense, the state has sort of returned, but neoliberalism seems to have a kind of ghost here in Britain. I'm having to update these slides, by the way. So Paul Ross had to go through a version of this a couple of weeks ago, and this wasn't here, mainly because of the changes around this kind of discourse in around neoliberalism in the UK. What's interesting for me, though, is in a sense, neoliberalism isn't about what's happening in the global north, right? So when we have arguments that the state would return, and if we'd done this maybe 6 months ago, it would have been an argument on the left that the state has returned. It's possible now to do things like Green New Deals and UBI and all of these good things, right? In a sense, that is not a history of neoliberalism that I understand. The history of neoliberalism is about the exploitation of the global south, the bringing of people into the labor market. There you go, it's in my videos as well. Okay. When we think about the, you need to mute yourself there, Russell.
Yeah, I think someone.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find it.
Yeah.
Are we okay? Wow. Wow. Wow, to hybrid, huh? Might want to rethink this. Okay, so when we think about neoliberalism, when we think about UBI, we have to think about the global forms of exploitation that underpin all of that. And that inherently relies on racialized labor and racialized communities being exploited. And this is kind of written out of this debate. So I think it's a very Eurocentric debate on the left that we're having. Why is this important? Well, the real history of neoliberalism isn't simply about the attack of welfare states or the demolishing of the social compact that happens in the global north in places like the UK. It's actually about the expansion of global capitalism and highly exploitative forms of capital into the global south, right? The demolishing of the Third World Project, Vijay Prasad calls the Third World Project, or the battle for economic sovereignty that happened in the Third World during the 60s and 70s, and the forms of intercontinental solidarity were around that. Now, that wasn't a perfect project, but partly neoliberalism is a response, these are the Chicago boys, to the new international economic order, right? The kind of plans in the global south for a different form of economy that would help those racialized workers and racialized populations in the global south, what we used to call the third world, achieve economic sovereignty. And so when we leave that bit of this narrative out, then when we talk about the end of neoliberalism, what are we really talking about? And actually, when we go to the global south, if we look at people's work like the Patnaiks, right? So I don't know if sociology teaches this stuff, or I wish it does. Part of the reason I'm giving this paper is to say that those of us who do anti-racism should understand these debates around the global economy. Patnaik and her husband Prabhat Patnaik have written a great book which essentially theorizes a relationship of imperialism between the North and the South, right? Neoliberalism is a fluctuating part of that process. And their argument is, essentially, you cannot escape the fact that the imperial countries are having to extract value out of the global South, right? And when that ends, we will actually end versions of capital. I don't want to get into that, but what I want to get into is if you theorize that way, the end of neoliberalism debate simply can't just be about us or the return of the state here. And what do we see actually happening in the end of neoliberal era? Well, actually, if you look at global debt, and today the World Bank, the head of the World Bank came out and said, global debt's getting really high, everyone stop trying to fund energy transfers to your populations. Google that in the FT, it was a really interesting kind of intervention. It was like, yeah, you know, you shouldn't actually give energy stuff to all of your population. That's a bit wrong, like target stuff. But global debt, ironically, in the global south is expanding. It's becoming huge, right? There's going to be another debt crisis like there was in the 1980s. But again, these happens to be largely in brown and black countries that we don't even think about as part of this problem, right? So if you think about this big signal crisis with Sri Lanka, you've seen Sri Lanka in the news recently. Sri Lanka is a big signal crisis for how global debt is transferring. This is African debt with the IMF interventions. Huge are flowing into countries. If we then skip on and we look at the research generated by groups like Oxfam during the era of COVID, right? The IMF rolled into many countries into the global south, provided lots of emergency funding, but in exchange, as all IMF loans are, for large bits of austerity. When I gave this paper 6 months ago, there was a bit of a hope that there would be a version of Keynesianism returning here. And people were arguing, well, there's going to be austerity in the South. Looks like we're going to have austerity here, and there'll definitely be austerity in the South, right? So these loans are conditional, normally based on spending cuts. Now, for those of you who don't know, the history of neoliberalism in the South is actually largely this, right? It's not significantly altered. So whose end of neoliberalism is actually happening? Or is the end of neoliberalism really positive in the global South as we perceive it to be in the global South? So where we see a policy room, what's happening there? So I think that debate inherently doesn't understand both the imperial and racialized characters of global capital. All right, that's my argument. Why is this important? Why is this important? And then there's a second argument to the end of neoliberalism debate. I just want to destabilize. So I think I've destabilized the first part, that neoliberalism's over, because I think in the South it isn't over. Even if I do think elements of the global economy are changing in ways that are going to fundamentally transform our lives. But the other bit of this argument that you get on the left is that we're heading towards authoritarian capitalism, right? So we're now heading to an era of authoritarian capitalism. But those of us who do anti-racism, this is quite funny, because capital's been very authoritarian for quite a long time. I mean, I couldn't think of anything more authoritarian than virginity tests at Gatwick, right? And that's 1979. But we should deal with this. There is a version of what's happening both in the US, especially in the UK, and I want to destabilize reading that as the only versions of anti-racism. But in a sense, there is a version that what's happening is in these countries, as George Jackson theorized in Bloody Mary in the 70s, is we have a version of fascism that isn't about jackboots, but is about the usurping of constitutions, the usurping of our rights. The Institute of Race Relations has produced a wonderful kind of take on this called Impunity Entrenched. Please Google it and read it. It's written by someone called Frances Weber, who's a wonderful immigration lawyer. And she sets out essentially how the state, under Boris in particular, moved to kind of radically transform things. So the police crime and sentencing bill, for example, is a really draconian form of protest, right? But is it really that new? I want to take you back, right, to one of my heroes, Sivanandan. And Sivanandan writes a lot on the version of neoliberalism I just talked about. Way before, actually, lots of people who do international political economy came on to do stuff. But if you go back and read his most famous article, which is from Resistance to Rebellion, right? Written in 1981, and the end of it, he writes something really, really quite powerful. And he starts talking about the police force, a police force that essentially has too much power. Then he says this, and he says, it is not merely that the free market economy requires a law and order state, but that even in its passing, leaves only the option of a mixed economy with a corporate state maintained by surveillance. They are but two shades of the same authoritarianism, the one more modern than the other, but neither speaking to a birth of a new society. And in a sense, I think Sivanandan's quote is literally talking about our future. On one hand, we have the Conservative Party, and on the other hand, we're faced with Keir Starmer's version of authoritarianism, which includes parts of radically representational politics, but really at face level. I don't know if you saw him on the news yesterday. He was talking about how he would lock up people for protesting on roads around stopping oil production for much longer, right? The Chancellor was on Sky News arguing that actually the Conservative government had been inept at deporting people for the last 12 years and that Labour would do it better. What I want to argue is the authoritarian elements of capital, and not only unread the racialized histories of Britain, for those of us who anti-racist scholarship, we should be at the center of those debates. So the end of neoliberalism today to me suffers from two problems. One is Eurocentric. B, it doesn't understand the genealogy of authoritarianism, which runs across race and class and gender. All right. How am I doing for time, Reza? I got like 10 minutes? Okay.
We've got a lot more time.
Oh, okay. He said I got half an hour. It's okay.
We normally give our speakers 50 minutes.
Oh, I'll slow down then. All right. All right. Now. All right. Like speeding through this. All right, cool. Maybe I can end early. We can have some questions. All right. So what has this got to do with abolitionism? So, like I said, part of what I do is to look at, sorry, I moved away, I'm gonna get in trouble, is to look at anti-racist politics. And I want to know how we respond to both the changing elements of the global economy, but also how our own movements have been changing and moving across time and space. So for those of you who have been around for the last couple of years, it's been a delight that actually we now acknowledge that racism exists. Racism was acknowledged to exist 2 years ago after George Floyd's murder. Up until that point, it was a bit hazy. But now we're fully all certified that racism exists, even if the kind of responses to it are not very good. So like, you know, we still have institutional racism, but you've got a D&I committee. You've still got an attainment gap, but don't worry, you've got some representation somewhere. What I want to know is how does our politics, right, our movement, our struggle for liberation respond to that, right, to the previous changing of neoliberalism, to the end of it, or its perceived end, or to the changes I'm talking about? What exactly is it that our politics will do? And we have to base this on the fact that actually 2 years ago, especially in the US, we saw some of the biggest uprisings around anti-racism ever seen, right? Especially in the settler colony that is North America, right? Huge amounts of uprisings, lots of potential. And then, like I said, a kind of drawdown of all of this. So one of the books I recommend reading is Ilyas Nagi's and Aswad Safar's Race to the Bottom, which has just come out, which is a history of British anti-racism, which I think charts things really well, and then also tries to deal with like how we ended up, instead of change, we ended up with D&I committees and things like that. All right. Not that they're all terrible, by the way, before anyone has to go on me about that. But part of the narrative that emerged out of that was this politics of abolition. Now, actually in the UK, abolitionism, or the kind of critique of the prison, has been centre to our politics for a long time, especially of the police. Some of the prior research I did was on British Black Power. And if you go back into the 60s and 70s, you will see versions of abolition there, right? Versions of ideas of the police not serving communities, of communities being able to do things better than themselves as independent bodies. You also see that in the US or across other spaces. You'll see the critique of the prison. Again, I've done a lot of work on the Black Panther Party. If you read Huey P. Newton's take on the prison, you'll see it as essentially a kind of foregrounding of these abolitionist politics. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Michel Foucault, as we know, read the Black Panthers and riffed off elements of his work as he produced it in the 1970s. So we already know that this is a long-standing kind of bit of anti-racism, but particularly in the last couple of years, abolitionism has become a term embraced by young activists across the nation. You'll hear people refer themselves, I'm an abolitionist. So the ideas of prison abolition and defunding the police have really become quite popular. And like I said, based on a long time narrative, but really gained a lot of purchase. And this is the second iteration of Black Lives Matter. If you think the first iteration happened around 2013-14, abolitionism is there, but it's not so much right front and center. And they're really interesting claims, because what they're arguing is that our very social fabric, the institutions that we kind of think we need to protect us, actually need abolishing, but quite what gets left out of this narrative is they need rebuilding, right? We need to rebuild these institutions, not as they were, Abolitionists don't really want to rebuild the police. They don't think you can reform it. I would agree. But they would like to rebuild as a social fabric so that the outcomes where people perceive you need the police are essentially got rid of, or at least maintained much better than they are, right? It's a radical form of politics. It also really works well for right-wing shock jocks, because the idea that, you know, you defund the police and then what do you do with murderers it becomes a weird debate. But essentially, it's about remaking our social institutions. And that actually is a form of politics that goes across various political traditions and spectrums. The idea that we remake our social institutions. And this is largely around anti-racist goals, right? How do we deal with elements of racial stratification that run across issues also of gender and sexuality? How do we remake our social institutions this way? I'm really, really, really passionate about that. I think it's wonderful, actually, when you meet abolitionist scholars, activists in a room. A couple of weeks ago, I actually helped organize an event where we put lots of people that believe in this stuff in one room on a Saturday, and there were over 200 people there, right? I don't know, maybe people didn't have anything to do that weekend, but it was a wonderful kind of sense of like purpose. What I want to say is that when we read what's happened in the global economy, when we read what's happening with racialized communities and nations outside of the West, how does abolitionism respond, in a sense, to those imperial dynamics? What are its demands for that, right? So what is an abolitionist internationalism? And how does that phrase? And I think that's actually something we have to think about collectively. So if you read a lot of abolitionist texts, you'll often see there's like a footnote, like they'll say globalization, racial capitalism, and then it's kind of footnoted like these are serious issues. But actually what we need to also think about is how are we thinking about the abolition of the very structures of the global economy, which I tried to show you earlier are inherently racist, right? They are not benign processes. They are inherently racialized processes that lead to early death, as Ruthie Wilson Gilmore would call it, right? That's her definition of racism. And I think this is important because what came out of those wonderful street energy, all right, when people hit the streets in the US and the UK, but also across Europe and other places, was the sense of, especially in the era of COVID, the idea that we should rebuild things, right? Like I said, that we should remake our society. And I want to see how that energy, what would that look like? And it's a gentle critique, it's not a big critique. I'm saying, like, do we actually think about remodeling those elements of the global economy when we think of abolitionism? Well, we'll need to, because I think abolitionism as a form of politics will find a new context, which is this version of austerity 2.0, right? Which ironically in the US is not so much happening. Joe Biden's not really into that. He's still doing the made in America stuff. And I think actually the death of neoliberalism debate there is actually more pertinent. But abolitionism, I think, will rise again to the front of this because we will be confronted with another attack on our social institutions again. And when we have an attack on our social institutions, I don't need to tell you guys, it's people that look like me, not of my social class though, right? I do quite well for myself these days. But it's people that look like me who end up getting the worst of it. So we look at who got the worst of austerity. I don't have the graph here, but if I put up a graph of who will have the coldest homes this winter, it would be the Bangladesh community, the Pakistani community, disproportionately. So I think abolitionism as a form of politics actually will return again because it makes sense to confront attack on our social institutions, what's left of them. I don't really know what's left of our social institutions anymore. The last decade has just been quite bad. But I think it will return. But what about in the South? What about outside of here? This is a map of countries who rejected, as the COVID pandemic took place and Big Pharma came to kind of create solutions to these problems. India and South Africa tabled a motion at the World Trade Organization to basically suspend, make this simple, I don't want to get into the dynamics of it, but to suspend the patent law on COVID-19 vaccines, right? The countries in yellow all supported it, and the countries in pink, although the US did change its mind slightly after this map was created, although it hasn't really pushed for anything after this, rejected it. If I did a map of center and periphery, it would largely look like this, wouldn't it? All right, and in fact, I'll show you some more maps and they all look like this. I love maps. They all look like this. It's great. Right? And quite recently, even in the WTO, World Trade Organization sharing zone in Cape Town, the big pharma companies essentially got really angry about this sharing or the redesigning of their product from bottom up by researchers there. And they described the copying of their vaccine as being like copying a Louis Vuitton handbag. What I want to say is that this isn't simply the realm of patent lawyers or people who do international political economy or pharmaceuticals. This actually is the cause of anti-racism because this is a racialized map. And those have racialized outcomes in the sense of who will get access to these vaccines, who will get access to technologies, right? These are actually anti-racist issues, but we don't tend to see them that way because our politics is reframed into what I think is a more natural national context. Because when our social institutions are being attacked, of course, we think, hey, but they have real racialized outcomes. This is life expectancy in 2019. I actually think the map will look a bit different after COVID. I couldn't find the updated data. But again, if I was doing a map of center and periphery, it would look like this. All these maps tend to look the same. It's a bit weird. We could do this for illicit financial flows. And my favorite one is corruption. No corruption in the global north at all. Yellow is you're not corrupt, the red is are you corrupt. What I want to say is the politics of abolition, the politics of the thing that's animating our anti-racism in the 21st century has to be aware of these issues. It has to be centered on some of these issues and it has to kind of unpick them for us, right? So to the list that we say borders, police, prisons, and abolishing them and remaking them, I would say we need to reactivate a sense of abolishing the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund. Let's abolish it twice, to be fair. The World Bank, agreements like the patents agreement, which is called the TRIPS agreement, things that are seen not in the realms of anti-racism, but actually are about a racialized world, all right? Because essentially what these institutions do is they value some lives of others. And because of the coordinates of the imperial dimensions of the economy, because of the racialized history of the economy, it is on large brown and black non-white people outside of Europe who end up falling foul of these things. And they end up dying. Yeah. I think these issues have to be at the core of our anti-racist struggle. Because actually at the core of, if you haven't got the twig, I'm a kind of unreformed Marxist. In a sense, they have to be at the core of class struggle, all right? And this is really pertinent. Abolitionist scholars will actually make this link themselves and do this all the time. This is a wonderful book by actually quite a lot of friends of mine called Empire's Endgame. And if you flick to page 92, they actually have a really, really good rundown of like the disattachment of anti-racism from anti-imperialism, right? Our prior history of anti-racism, especially in this country from the 1950s and 60s onwards, was rooted in a form of anti-imperialism. Now, it was a quite easy form of it, right? There were good guys, there were bad guys. Good guys look like me, bad guys look like, I don't know, like Boris Johnson. And it was quite easy to navigate all of this stuff. It was a prior world of third world solidarity and lots of other things. And it was really easy to navigate, right? And actually lots of us who came here from those countries, say from the Indian subcontinent, or from the Caribbean, were directly linked sometimes, the activists, to the anti-imperialist struggles in those countries, right? Think of really famous names like Darcus Howe, right? Fundamentally linked to what was happening in Trinidad around the emergence of Black power in Trinidad, helps spread Black power in London and across the UK. There was a fundamental link. Look at the Indian Workers Association, fundamental link with what was happening in India. That has shifted, right? That's no longer the era, and there were troubles with that era. So we can no longer go back to the simple game of there is the kind of non-aligned movement, and there's the global south or the third world and the global north. Things are not so straight around those things. In fact, that era wasn't so straight, right? So as those countries in the third world were decolonizing and independence movements created forms of solidarity like the non-aligned movement, or stemming from Bandung, or the UNCTAD in the UN, or the G77, whilst they were trying to shift things to a new international economic order, they largely were really bad with democracy at home. Yeah? Like, I love Kwame Nkrumah. I think he's the most wonderful scholar. But let's not joke. Like, at his high point, he's also banning trade unions. He's also stymieing democracy, right? And then even other heroes who turn up, like Malcolm X, have to kind of not talk about that and have to talk about the global environment. But we shouldn't shy away from the fact that there is, when we think about anti-racism, there is a link to anti-imperialism. And that kind of also does another thing for abolitionism. Abolitionism is centered actually on the rejection of large bits of state structures. The idea of the state as violence is, I think, a paramount bit of abolitionist thought. So in a sense, it focuses on communities, right? As the state cannot be trusted, it focuses on communities. And we are actually in an era where actually those communal struggles are really difficult to bring into context and into narratives with each other. So actually part of the anti-racist agenda from an abolitionist perspective must be to bring debates like the Indian farmers, peasants movement into debates around Black Lives Matter, to the Palestinian liberation cause, to what happens at Grenfell, to what's happening in Latin America right now, which is the return of social democracy, which I'm quite happy about, even if it hasn't gone fully as well as it could have done. And let's hope Bolsonaro loses very soon. That's a real problematic of abolitionism, right? But when we read back that problematic that I was talking about the World Bank, about the IMF as racist problems, then actually we are brought back to the problem of states and what states are viable to make changes there, because elements of these communities may not be able to do this. Although the Indian farmers movement, I think, is a world historical event, and just no one here pays attention to it. I mean, what these people did, if you don't know about it, Google it, is they essentially, for a while anyway, have stopped neoliberal land reform in India. I mean, it's the most amazing thing. If I've got to say, if they had been white, we would have had a public holiday here, right? Well, it does bring the problem of how do we deal with states? For example, it was India and South Africa, and I am no fan of either of those states' regimes, particularly the Indian one, which I think is a quasi-fascist or just straight out fascist regime. But they lodged something at the state level, trying to destabilize that pattern law. What is our relationship then to the state, right? As we take on these anti-racist politics of abolition, and they've come over, or we've embraced prior parts of our history, because prior parts of our own British anti-racism were to actually think state structures were important, that state structures were paramount to changing things, and that we needed to have interaction with state leaders, right? And this is happening at a global level. So I don't know if you've all been paying attention, or how could you not be paying attention to the Russian invasion of Ukraine? But at the UN, very interesting things have been happening that are not explainable in the simple good and bad narrative of Russian imperialism, right? So when they've had votes at the UN General Council, General Sitting, right? States in the global south have not backed the sanctions regime being placed on Russia, right? And that's not because they back Russian imperialism, right? Or Russian aggression. It is because they understand the sanctions regime and the damaging nature of sanction regimes to a populace. They also understand the dangerous nature of war in Europe and nuclearized war. Right? It's really interesting. For like 10, 20 years, you know, we didn't think nuclear war was a thing, and it suddenly re-emerged. And these states in the global south have been saying, no, I think this is quite bad. Like, you guys need to chill out, right? Like, you need to sort this out diplomatically. It's quite an interesting kind of take on this. It's not a new non-aligned movement, but it essentially is a form of non-alignment. So states are doing things at a level, right? And as abolitionists, as anti-racists, how do we respond to the emergence of global South states doing this? And what is our politics linked up to that? I had comrades in a big quadri. I give you like anecdote, like, and I think it was really stupid. Like, one was like, well, you know, you all seen what's happening in Iran. Yeah, women are basically revolutionizing the country. You still get like weird comrades on Twitter saying like, you know, but Iran is an anti-imperialist state, we should back it. And you're like, these are normal, sensible people. And you're like, oh my God, I'm gonna privately send you a message like you're being an idiot, right? This is not, this is not the hill to die on. It's the people that you should be with. But we should also not all renounce all state power, specifically in the third world. I think this is a total bad thing to do. Just because the state is bad here, and we could have a talk about whether how bad it is or whether it's redeemable, doesn't mean that all of the state structures outside of here necessarily have to be problematic. And also, as we transcend it, hopefully it will wither away. But I want to bring you finally to this lady. Does everyone know who this is? You heard of her before, Mia Mottley? She's the leader of Barbados. If you haven't, Google her after the Queen's death. It's so good. You guys are like, yeah, we like Lizzie, but now we're gone. Ciao, ciao, right? We're not doing the Charles thing. We're gonna get a new head of state. What's interesting is she has been leading, and again, it's not as radical as I would probably demand, but hey, I work in a university, so I just demand stupid things all the time. She works in the real world and she's demanding. What she's doing is she's running something called the Bridgetown Agenda. Again, Google this if you have the chance. What she's trying to do is bring countries in the global south who are experiencing climate change into conversation with each other, into conversation with the IMF, into conversation even with the imperialist powers I call, or countries in the global south, in the global north, right? Like the US, like her meeting Camilla Harris, you know, which I guess from an abolitionist perspective is like meeting a cop. But in a sense, this is happening, right? And what is our relationship as anti-racist activists to what's happening here? Because as I said, those structures of the global economy are key to racialization, to racial inequality, and to essentially early death, right? So what is our relationship to that? So I'm gonna end slightly early, because I ran through the bits. Okay? This is actually a problematic for the changing nature of the global economy, the changing nature of how the global south countries are running that actually creates a problematic for our abolitionist politics, because it's how do we respond to that? And if I had longer, I could give you a whole history about how anti-racism and anti-imperialism were once very much more closer together. And what I would say is this: whilst it is right for us to argue for the abolition of the state institutions that oppress us in the global north, we also must be advocating not simply for the abolition of borders, which is a very, very good thing, and we should all close down Yarlswood, but our politics should also understand, analyze, and form connections with the abolition of the very bits of the global economy that both enact racial exploitation, but also early death. And so I want to end with a quote with one of my favorites, which is Brother Malcolm, right? And Brother Malcolm is giving this talk in 1965, and he's being asked, he used to have a very famous analogy with a word I'm not going to use, but he used to call something the house and the field, right? And the house was a really nice place. You wanted to be in the house. And the field is where the enslaved were. And there were elements of the enslaved in the house who got kind of bougie and, you know, enjoyed it, even though they were oppressed as well. But if you actually look at his analysis in 1965, he starts to actually theorize this at an international level. And he thinks of the house as what we could call the West, and he calls the field essentially the third world. And he says, thinking about how anti-racism is linked together, he says, now the man was shook up enough when Africa was in revolt and when Asia was in revolt. All of this revolt was actually taking place on the outside of his house, on the outside of his base, or on the outside of his headquarters. Now he's faced with something new. Just as the French and the British and the Americans form one huge home or house or power structure, those brothers in Africa and Asia, although they were fighting against it, they also have some brothers on the inside of the house. And his argument was that anti-racism, both in the US, both in the UK, Europe, in other places, was integral to anti-imperial struggle, right? So in some ways, the globalization of abolitionist politics, or not in the same context, as I've kind of destabilized that, right, has to be key to how we're dealing with the ramifications, not only of the changing natures of the structures of our racial inequality, which will be austerity 2.0, but also the racialized inequality underpins rising global debt, rising inflation, food inflation in the global south, and inequality of democracy at global institutions. Unless we globalize our abolition is fairly limited. All right, I'll leave it there, and then we can have some questions.
Great. Thank you very much, John. Some very big themes opened up there. So, yeah, I was just going to say, if you maximize that screen, then you can start with some, Q&A in the room, but also bring other people in offline. So, anyone like to start the rolling? Yeah, please go ahead, and Bridget, you can be next.
Thank you. So what do you think are our best options, and hopefully there are options for kind of mobilizing people within in a way that kind of expresses international solidarity or global solidarity? Do you think, is it through information technology? Is it trying to do things at the same time, or should we just try and do the best we can with what we have in our countries? Like, what's the best way you think to go about it?
Question. Should we take a couple?
How you prefer? Okay, so Bridget, you wanted to ask one.
Yeah, it's kind of related to that, but also I just thought, for those of you who don't know, and it's pertinent to that last quotation, the guy from the European Commission talking about gardens.
Yeah.
So saying Europe is a garden, we've built a garden, the rest of the world is not exactly a garden, most of the rest of the world is a jungle, and the jungle could invade the garden, which I think speaks exactly to this. But I think this idea of invasion and the jungle invading I'm interested in you maybe talking a little bit more about migration. So you talked about border abolition, and I think that's important. And I think the kind of connections that are being made in kind of theory and practice between prison abolition and border abolition are really exciting. But I think in terms of like some of the maps and stuff, I think sometimes we can get hung up on territory. Like actually the global south is in the global north and vice versa. And so when we look at those maps, it doesn't show us that. And I think migration is precisely the ways in which you can make those connections. And actually, I think that the ways in which, and again, you alluded to this, but I'd be interested in you talking more about it, the ways in which basically the anti-racist and anti-imperialist struggle was connected to migration up until really the mid-80s, and that it drifted away, so that now we have anti-racism on the one hand and migrant and refugee support organizations on the other. They don't speak to each other. And I think that there's issues with the migration sector, but I also think there's big issues with the anti-racism sector. And it's really important to start joining this up. And I would say, kind of in part in your response to your question, that actually thinking about migration and asylum as fundamentally anti-racist issues, but also as migration, as anti-racist issues, as unavoidably about those, is something that, that's a kind of that's an easy win, and it's a trick we need to do. So I'm interested. Oh, sorry, that's not really a question, but I'm interested in you talking more about the connections between anti-racism and migration. Cool.
And Ross, please go ahead.
You mentioned that a lot of anti-racist organisers are now describing themselves as abolitionists. And Dylan Rodriguez says that it's not possible to be an abolitionist. Abolition is a praxis formed in struggle through community. I wonder if this self-identification is maybe part of the problem of why we sometimes struggle to make it international. If you had something to say that, and then how this maybe plays into identity politics as well.
Sure. Okay. I'm a sociologist by training, so shall we do that? Because that's 3. And sociologists do things in 3s all the time. All right. Brilliant questions. The first question is actually we'll get back to, because that's always the question of how do we solve everything, which is a good question, but it's always a big question. I think, all right, Bridget, let's start with I I fundamentally agree. I would say the microcosm of that debate on a kind of epistemic level is the relationship between the BSA race and ethnicity streams and the migration panels that happen at our annual conference, where I don't see a lot of people going between them often, which I always find quite funny and quite interesting. But yeah, no, but part of that has been the transformation, I guess, of what we could, what Sivananda called xenoracism, and how that fitted with an older form of racism, which was color encoded. And actually, part of the migration battles aren't simply across those parameters. So maybe some of the groups haven't thought, okay, so the attacks on it's a bit like, do you remember when we had Brexit? I hate to use that word. And there were lots and lots of kind of European communities essentially saying, I'm really scared of being deported. Do you remember those things? And some of the people I know at first were like, well, now you know how it feels. Right? And it was, but then I would say, like in those circles, yeah, but this is an issue. So I think it's about reconnecting some of the, because it's not all the same communities now fundamentally having that struggle. Even if we looked at like traditionally Black communities, right? It's essentially debates around people from different countries. So I think we need to reconnect some of the language up, some of the causes up. And I am seeing a lot of the younger activists attempting to do that, right? They're attempting to put that language together. But no, I fundamentally agree that issues of migration become like a central force around entering into this politics. And it's a politics of solidarity that extends beyond, like I said, the simple color encoded racism that we used to think racism was about. It stretches to different communities. On the element of the global north, global south, yes, fundamentally agree. And when I teach global north, global south, I normally put a map up where you can see elements of the global north and the global south and vis-a-vis, because essentially they're not geographic spaces, they're actually probably relationships of class, in my opinion, right? I think yes, but I will slightly not push back. It's not push back. I'm saying in general, those structures though on those maps still largely hold up, right? Even though there's been some kind of insurgence. So the Chinese taking of 600 million people out of poverty, whatever you think about the Chinese regime, is one of the greatest feats of human development, right? Like we've ever seen. Whether the Chinese regime is justified in what it does then by doing other things is a totally different question. But actually, the insurgency isn't so insurgent. So even if there is a growing global middle class, but I fundamentally agree we could join them up. But the one thing I'm trying to say is that actually as anti-racists, as migration specialists, as those of us who are about those campaigns, we should also understand the dynamics of the global economy. And to be honest, the literacy around that is not as high as I think it could be. That's part of what my intervention is. I'll come back to the first question, because I think it's a really good question. Abolitionism as practice, yes. Look, part of the reason there was a destabilizing of anti-racism and anti-imperialism wasn't simply because of the changing nature of demographics, wasn't necessarily a changing nature of our politics here. It was because anti-racism was funneled towards a nationalist lens, right? So if you think about anti-racism and anti-imperialism, then in a sense, as I teach my students, anti-racism is not possible without anti-imperialism. But actually we work in a context where anti-racism is seen as possible via national settlements, and national settlements of representation. So you can have, like I said, Black and brown faces in high places. You can sort stuff on sports pitches. You can put people in certain forms of offices. You can, and we have loads of this, don't we? Like, there is so much anti-racism today. Like, you can literally you can buy so many books. People do Guardian workshops for liberals who want to learn how to be anti-racist. Isn't it so funny that there's so much anti-racism, yet we still have these racialized problems? I mean, we had so much anti-racism, but we still can't solve these issues. So I think part of that is how it was pushed that way. As abolitionism as an identity, the abolitionists I know run that way. I think it is praxis, but it's interesting about how that praxis perceives the anti-imperialist element, because the anti-imperialist element creates contradictions for us, like I said, around the state. And I don't think these are like aporia. I don't think we can go, like they necessarily mean abolitionism is dead. I think it means that we have to think about how those things are put together, which then goes back to this point about what is the international forms of solidarity. But I would say, like, Bridget said, I think that part of that is these causes, right? Dealing with the institutions that create harm, the institutions that kill rather than the institutions that just discriminate. But also we need to have a kind of, like I said, a literacy around some of these forms of international political economy. In the same way, when I go and talk to people who do international political economy, that they need a literacy around racism, it's us as anti-racists who need also a literacy around some of these issues around anti-imperialism. And then we can do the forms of solidarity that we're talking about. Because actually the agents of, like I'm saying, in the Global South, like me and Motley, like the Indian farmers movement, may demand forms of solidarity that we can't prescribe yet, if that makes sense. They will emerge, and then it's about how do we respond to those things as they emerge. Or to see them as anti-racist causes in one way lends itself to being able to then provide that form of solidarity. That makes sense? Kinda? We can talk after.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I just want to say something when you were making analysis on the African countries on the front runner for the Russia. Well, I don't think I want to agree with you that is based on the war effects or thereabout. I think one of the major factors there has to be the economy, the market reforms. For instance, most of the African countries, for instance, I come from Nigeria, for instance, most of the African countries have ongoing infrastructural development with Chinese government. Also, there's a lot of market opportunities between Chinese and the African countries. So, and they're looking at that as a top priority rather than getting involved in Russia, Ukraine, or in fact, the way they see it in the African concept or the Nigerian country, we look at it as the war between the Russia and the global, the South. We're looking at the economy as our big impact or our big focus, rather than getting involved in more international relations or international politics. So I think that is the driving force in Africa, not getting involved, because China and Russia have a good relationship, and China have invested so much and is still doing a lot of, business agreements with African countries. So I think the economy is the main dividing force.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I could add something to that as another question, or at least a question, but it's not so much a specific question, but one that asks whether some of the analytical frame that you were using makes sense in the light of what we've just heard, and to which I'd add. So if you want to look at the ways in which state power and capitalism, global capitalism, come together in various ways, and obviously in certain very powerful ways in certain places, does it really make sense to think that seeing things in terms of the global north and the global south, i.e. a binary, really captures the distribution of state power and penetration into various kinds of economies? Just heard about Nigeria, and what's true about Nigeria is true about, as I'm sure you very well know, about another 10 African economies, countries. And I mean, Pakistan is very dependent on Chinese economy, as well as, of course, the political assistance, to such an extent that Prime Minister Imran Khan, now deposed, but he wasn't willing to say anything in public to criticize the detention of 1 million Uyghurs into various kinds of concentration camps for re-education, torn away from their families. And yet, I mean, he was willing, if some Muslims were maltreated in Bradford, he'd be very happy to make a speech about that and say that he was going to take it up at the, the Pakistani High Commission in London, or just, use the social media to make a protest or to shame the British government if that's so. Does it really, and that's just a few words, just a tip of the iceberg. I mean, obviously, in terms of structure and power, it's a lot more complex than that. And as you know, we're only a few years away if current trends continue, in particular, if pre-COVID trends continue, from the Chinese economy being the largest in the world and possibly becoming more both self-sufficient and having greater penetration in the global economy and having more countries for whom China is their biggest trader investor and who they certainly wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of. So basically, I wanted to reinforce what was said about Africa and say, well, actually, it's global.
Yeah, okay. Cool. Do you want anyone else?
Maybe take those two now, and then we'll also ask people.
I would agree with you. I don't think we're disagreeing. I would say yes, part of the geoeconomics drives that. Also part of the geopolitics of this also drives it, right? Because if you do have war, like you're having rising food prices. So your economy can't grow. So you're fundamentally right. So I don't think we disagree. I think market provision does work for that. And this goes to the binary of what I'm talking about the state functions, but also what we could call communities of resistance, or we could call, I don't know, people struggling. So think about Nigerian context. So you have Nigerian state, right? What I'm saying is it's interacting in a state level where we can't just say that state's evil, but then we wouldn't valorize it because look at the NSAS movement. Look at the Nigerian forms of activism that are trying to change their own state. So, and this goes back to your point. So there isn't, the analytical frame isn't simply to revert back to states. The analytical frame is to say that the frame of looking at communities who are resisting actually needs to understand state structures. So I'm not valorizing one state structure or another, or the global south or global north. Although look, I do tend to think some of it's overblown about the changing nature of global middle income countries. So China may become the world's biggest economy in nominal GDP, but GDP per capita, it's still a middle income country, and it will be a middle income country for a long time. So that's actually not the kind of gotcha moment. So the Chinese economy becomes the biggest economy, but by per head, it's not possible. In fact, Chinese levels of GDP per capita can never replicate the West, because if they did, the world is over ecologically. That's just simply a fact. So yes, I agree. I agree. But what my actual frame is saying is, how does the movements that we're valorizing look at actually respond to those state structures? So how do abolitionist politics, how does the NSAS movement, how do we bring these things together? Because actually they've been disattached. So it's not a either or.
You slightly misunderstood what I was saying, John. I wasn't saying your prescriptions were about valorizing the state, making states stronger. I even got to your prescriptions. I said the analysis that you're offering before any prescriptions even begin, i.e., particular view of the global economy and its relationship with state power, which you said was of a kind that if people talked about the end of neoliberalism, they were misunderstanding what was happening in the world. So I was asking about whether you're deploying an analytical frame that sufficiently has traction with the real world. Forget about what we should do if it does, but does it even get to the first base? And on the point about China's standard of living in terms of income of the majority of people in China, I mean, that's not really what will exert economic power. I mean, just having a very big economy, a critical mass of, with a single party rule of the kind that we're currently seeing becoming even more centralized and so on. I mean, you can exert enormous power over countries like in Africa, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, I mean, dozens of other countries. And the ordinary Chinese people have a lower standard of living than people in Singapore, much lower standard of living in Singapore. You wouldn't say, oh, that means the Chinese economy has no power over Singapore because the people in Singapore have a higher standard of living.
No, but what I'm saying is we don't actually disagree. What I'm saying is that actually that framework, right? The framework I'm suggesting is about the communities underneath those states. We don't necessarily disagree. I think what you're saying is essentially I'm wrong to use the term imperialism, but we can account for China in this schematic. Because actually what I'm focusing on is how do you bring essentially community liberation vis-a-vis state politics. So I get what you're saying, but it's not inherently, it's not the point of this paper, but it could inherently be the point of expanding abolitionism to deal with state politics, right? So how would Chinese communities essentially liberate themselves via a state structure? I don't think we actually disagree too much. It's just you want to insert China into the narrative around imperialism, which is fine. But in terms of actually extraction of value, extraction of labor hours, the West still largely is a much bigger problem.
Okay, well, I certainly don't want to reject anyone who wants to agree with me. So,
I'll agree. No, we can
maybe say we agree. But maybe we should allow people who've been listening online to also join through comments and questions if they would like to. You can do so by making your video live so we can see you and you can ask the question orally. Has Reza gone out the room? Because I take it that you have that
I
power
can
to do that. I don't know. Therese, are you able to use your video function? I mean, if you want to, if people want to, people don't want to do that. Hi, Therese, we can all see you now.
Yeah.
I was just checking.
I want to reassure you it's working.
So I wasn't saying you had to ask a question. I just wanted to check that function exists for anyone who would like to ask and be seen to ask, as opposed to be just a voice. But also, I mean, I wasn't saying the people in the room couldn't continue to ask questions. So I was asking them to be able to join in. But if people want to introduce new lines of questions or pick up anything that's been discussed so far, either would be welcome. Yes, please. Yes, please do.
No, so just thinking also about abolitionism as an approach is actually, so one of the things that I think is very striking about prison abolitionism is it's very US, now it's UK oriented. It's like there's prisons in every country, and yet actually the idea of abolition prison abolition hasn't taken off, or isn't as in a kind of grassroots way. And I would say it's some ways similar to border abolitionism, which perhaps is more generally kind of spread among Europe and North America, but actually that too is not an abolitionism that you see in the global South. And yet these are the two forms of abolitionism that I would say are kind of very prominent in informing abolitionist thinking in the global north. So because my question is, so you talked about abolish the WTO, but so are those movements that you are referring to in based in global north, in South countries, are they framed in terms of abolitionism? And if not, is there a risk of doing a kind of what you could call a kind of intellectual imperialism by imposing this abolition framing?
No, the first bit, no, if we're talking about that from our perspective in the global north, right? But if you renamed those other movements in the global south around abolition, then I think that would be problematic, because I don't think that's their prerogative. What I'm talking about, I'm addressing that US-UK lineage. although, I mean, prison abolitionism as a concept actually stretches beyond those two poles. I mean, we can talk after, I'll send you the work of a person up in St. Andrews who's doing wonderful work around prison abolitionism beyond those two poles, in places like Iran, and which I think is actually really powerful in decentralizing that kind of idea of that it's just a transatlantic thing. And she has this wonderful story of activists in Palestine writing to Angela Davis when she was in prison. So I don't fully accept, it's the way it's presented, but I don't actually fully accept abolitionism is a UK-US thing. I actually think it is a transnational thing. When you go back to the 70s, there's much more to it than that. But yes, that would be if I was doing that. If I was trying to rename those movements in the Global South as abolitionism, yes. But when our politics is rooted in that, then in a sense, I'm asking for our politics to expand. How does our politics of abolitionism encompass those demands? Right? We don't have to call what's happening in the Global South abolitionism. And I think what Mia Motley's doing and people like that is not abolitionism. In fact, I think it's statecraft of an older kind, which I'm actually quite interested in seeing how it's going to play out. So, yeah, if we rename them that, then yes, it would be epistemic imperialism, but it's really not, because I'm addressing my audience. You see what I'm saying? That's for us. Like, what is it that our politics does? And then if we had to drop the term abolitionism to encompass that, that would be something else to think about. But yeah, definitely not renaming.
I just wondered if you work done by abolitionists on education, because it would seem that if we're talking about reimagining social institutions and how we live our lives, that education would be kind of a key thing. Yeah,
no, there's plenty of work around the nature of abolishing epistemic forms of hierarchy. I mean, the most popular version of that you guys would have heard of decolonizing the university, right? It's the logical conclusion to decolonizing the university is to abolish it and get rid of it, which actually most of the universities who embrace that term don't fully understand. And neither do we as academics when we run that term ourselves, right? Because actually, if we did run that to its logical term, we would abolish the university and create a different form of education. And that isn't raised around filtering or tuition fees. So yes, there's plenty of work on stuff like that. And I would say part of what I'm trying to do is argue that we do political education of our groups. This form of understanding the global economy is key to understanding essentially anti-racism.
I just want to remind us, or some of you don't know, to tell you that after we finish the discussion and not later than 6:30, there are drinks available outside where we can continue the conversation more informally and amongst ourselves. But at this point, I'd like to bring in someone online who won't have the chance to join us for drinks, and that's Dan Ocho, who's been waiting to ask a question. Go ahead, Dan.
Thanks, Tariq, and thank you, John. I'm not sure whether I've really got a fully formed question here, but I guess I just wanted to kind of perhaps return to some of the themes that that Bridget was discussing, and some of the early question discussion. So I do work on immigration detention and I guess particularly on the on the various forms of harm that detention and being detained produces. I'm just reflecting on some of the field work that I did in detention centres in 2017, 2018, and thinking about the sorts of things that people in detention were saying to me. I would say that there were a significant number of people who were very acutely aware of the kind of racialized dimensions of the global economy. People would talk about things in terms of like a border industry, a circle, a cycle, a factory, a sort of farm for human beings, and they bring in not just what happened to them in terms of being detained, but all sorts of things around that as well. And I suppose Also, people that are subject to these forms of border controls are coming into contact with various corporations all the time. They're being held by G4S. There's the tagging contracts by Serco. They're being transported by Mighty. When then the hotels, and now we've got the basically campsites with full of diphtheria. But what one thing that was kind of much less common was people going so far as to who are in detention, going so far as to call for its abolition. I think people were much more likely to suggest a time limit, or to say, well, actually detention should be for other people. It shouldn't be for people like me, or it shouldn't be for asylum seekers, etc., etc. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of question this, just because we can build a sort of better understanding or acknowledgement of the racialized nature of the global economy, does that necessarily reinforce our abolitionism and abolitionist activism? That's a kind of formed question. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Then I'll look at you that way. Sorry, there's multiple cameras. I would say, look, so what you're arguing is essentially, and I think there's good points here, which you're basically saying, well, actually, these people do have an understanding of, these are the detainees, right? Okay. Well, I mean, look, yes, detainees may not want to abolish some of these things and see, it's a bit like, it's a bit like the police, isn't it? Like, lots of us would like the police didn't pick on them, but pick on other people. Like, I quite like to see George Bush and Tony Blair in jail, right? But I guess abolitionist politics maybe should demand that I don't think like that. In terms of, so that in a sense is an individualist demand, I guess, but that's not a collective form of organizing or politics in its sense. So I'm thinking about what is the politics of this, right? And the politics of this is that, well, actually those dynamics of the racialized economy demand that we don't just think about abolishing those centers, which we should, but also that we start to demand the abolition of elements that create the very need for those centers, right? And I'm always give you this example is that I have to take a vitamin D supplement every day I'm in this country because it's got no sun. And I think actually we should make it better for people to stay in places if they want, where they don't need to take a vitamin D supplement every day. And actually lots of people are driven here because of the conditions of global capital, of the IMF, of the World Bank. So I would say, yes, we need to understand those institutions, and we need to understand, and look, abolitionism actually means remaking them. So you would, if you looked at the global economy, you would still need something that isn't the IMF, but actually does stuff around transferring, being the lender of last resort for the global economy. You'd probably still want an institution that allows development, right? Even if we may not think about development. So yeah, I think you actually do need that understanding of the global economy, and we would need to change those institutions. So I don't know if that's an answer. That's more of a kind of, I think you do need this knowledge to run this form of politics. That's just my take on it. I've got Rosa.
Yeah, Rosa, please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Thanks, John. That was really, really interesting. Thinking about a lot of the activists working around abolitionist causes, a lot of what seems to be happening at the moment is there's a lot of urgency around stopping prison expansion. And one of the concerns is because there's so much urgency around that part of what's being fought for really is just kind of maintaining the status quo. So I was wondering what you think the most effective way of approaching abolitionist causes is that aren't just kind of like fighting to maintain the nightmare that we already have, basically.
That's a really good question. I think part of that schematic is largely also because of the context we're in, right? So the abolitionist politics is actually a response to the failing of that prior era of especially in the UK, of anti-racism and anti-imperialism, what the state did, how it intermingled into people, how we ended up with like a generation of like essentially multiculturalism that then said like, it's fine, some of these people get on. Yeah, so it's actually a politics of survival. Yeah, and we shouldn't actually dismiss that is a politics of survival. You know, Rishi Sunak becoming prime minister is not going to do anything for Pakistani Bangladeshi communities. No matter, you know, we can argue over that over drinks, but in a sense, that politics of survival can become more radicalized if it has certain goals. And what I'm saying is that some of the most kind of interesting direct action work has been done on around Palestine, shutting down military factories, essentially. Abolitionism here around policing and its prison expansion has to, and I think has to also think about militarization. We're going to be dealing with the expansion of a defense budget. And we all know what happens when defense budgets get expanded. Normally those bombs fall on brown and black people. So there are realms of expansion of our politics that actually would be really, really effective, and not just with the status quo. I mean, Britain is one of the biggest arms dealers in the world. You know? So it's about bringing those causes together. I think if Chris Rosdale was here, he'd be like chiming in with me around this stuff. You can see what we get on. So in a sense, that's what we can do from that politics. But we are in a politics of survival because the state structures at the moment, anyway. I mean, look, only a few years ago, we thought maybe we'd get social democracy back in this country for all of its faults. You never know what could happen. Liz Truss thought she'd still be in power right now, didn't she? So in a sense, that politics survival has to wait for its openings. But there are ways of opening things around this form of analysis where I think we can actually create kind of really good interventions. Now, whether they lead to radical change or not is a totally different issue. But then I would say it's better to do something than nothing. Great question, thank you.
If no one online or in the room has a question, then perhaps we have reached a point where we can, those of us who are here anyway, have a drink and carry on our conversations over a drink. Before we thank John for this provocative talk and for taking some of us, certainly including me, well outside our comfort zone, can I just thank you for coming to this seminar, and I hope to see you at other Ethnicity Centre seminars and events. If you came here just with someone else and you're not actually on our email list, i.e. you didn't get an email advertising this event, then come and see me or Reza, who was here a moment ago, and we'll get you on our email list for future meetings. But before we go and have a drink, let's thank John in the usual way.